Welcome to today's webinar, 7 Steps to Becoming a Consumer-First Marketer. Your speakers today are Kat Berman and Adam Corey. Kat has more than 20 years of experience in digital marketing and over a decade focused on data-driven marketing strategies. As VP of Product Marketing at Selligent, Kat helps drive the positioning for Selligent's omni-channel engagement platform. Previously, Kat was an early member of Cheetah Mail, an industry-changing email platform that was acquired by Experian. Kat went on to serve as part of the senior management team at Experian Marketing Services, overseeing both client solutions and product marketing for its cross-channel group. And now on to Adam. Adam leads Tealium's marketing efforts and is responsible for driving awareness and education of tag management and customer data management. Adam has over 13 years of experience in digital analytics, marketing, and business development. Prior to joining Tealium, Adam led the solutions consulting groups at Upsite and Crowd Factory, which is now part of Marketo. Previously, Adam led technical production efforts at abcnews.com. And before we dive into the content, I'd like to take a moment to tell you a little bit about our sponsors. Selligent helps B2C relationship marketers better engage their customers with contextually relevant messages across all channels, both digital and offline. A global organization founded in Europe, Selligent is the largest independent provider of relationship marketing solutions, with 10 offices and 500 staff, serving over 700 brands around the world. Selligent helps brands embrace consumer-first marketing with proven solutions for insight-led engagement. We do this by bringing together consumer data and omnichannel execution into a single, natively integrated platform. By bridging the gap between data and campaign execution, Selligent enables marketers to boost both conversions and overall engagement. And now I'd like to tell you a little bit about our other webinar sponsor, Tealium. Tealium provides a universal data hub that connects all of your marketing and customer technologies together with a single view of your customer. Tealium integrates over 1,000 technologies into its platform. This means that the applications you use today can all work together to execute on your customer strategy. Over 700 customers around the globe use Tealium's tag management and customer data products to fuel best-in-breed customer experiences that drive revenue and delight customers. And now, with that brief plug out of the way, I would now like to turn the presentation over to Kat. Kat, you now have the floor.
Thanks, Jason. So this is your consumer. She has very high demands because she has lots of options. And in today's hyper-connected society, she expects you to know her, to know what she needs and to give it to her without any inconvenience to her. She expects it, and she believes she's entitled to it. Now, I myself am addicted to immediate gratification, and in fact, I'm one of these stats. I expect real-time customer service and on-demand appointments. I don't want any delays. I assume that very soon you'll be able to deliver me what I want before I even know I need it. And I don't care about any of the barriers to the fulfillment that you might have to face. I think I'm entitled to that. That's my expectation. And if you aren't able to deliver it for me, then that's my disappointment. Now, I am a bit past the millennial stage, but millennials are the largest cohort in our society, and we all have to deal with them, with a spending power over $3 trillion. So marketers can't ignore their needs. But they aren't just college students. They're young workers, they're parents, they're stressed with debt and with life. They have very little time, no patience, and they relate to the world through a filter of technology that has completely changed consumer behavior. They understand that every click leaves a bit of data behind, and they anticipate you're going to use those data trails to make their lives easier. They know it's possible to automate intelligently in an instant, and they're disappointed if you can't do it. So to make things even worse, the generation following will be even larger impacts in our society, have an even bigger spending influence, and even more demands and expectations for everyone to use the data and technology to remove friction and increase relevant experiences for them. And that's that at the end of the slide here, where they use an average of 5 screens simultaneously. That level of easy distraction, it adds to the challenges that we all face as marketers to gain their loyalty, especially when you consider that 8 seconds is the average attention span of a human being today in our mobile, multi-screen society, which is really sad when you think about it, because that is even less than the attention span of a goldfish, which is 9 seconds. So all of this has given rise to a new condition, a condition called CPA, or continuous partial attention. Brains today have literally been rewired to accommodate this disloyal, distracted behavior that we all go through. So when your commercial comes on, the phone comes out, they're scrolling through an Instagram, and because of this distracted state, they often don't complete processes. Maybe your consumer saw your ad, they checked out your site, they put something in the cart, but then they're off to the next thing and they didn't convert. So the game is not only to gain their attention, but to nurture them. And oftentimes that's through many very small bursts of interaction, but to nurture them all the way through this distraction to transaction. Now, this is a moniker of today's millennial, TLDR, too long didn't read. WTF is a bit from my generation, but I think that it speaks to what the holy grail really is, and that is what we're all after, the attention of the consumer. That's really it in order to be able to move them towards conversion. And to get there, we all have to shift our thinking. There has to be a new way of contemplating marketing and talking to these consumers. Now, the traditional model was something like this, where marketers really looked at the channels they were trying to communicate against. They went after the data they needed in order to be able to cut those segments and craft a message and push it out to the consumer. But really, that has flipped. Today, in consumer first world, we really have to start with the consumer and think about what is relevant to her, and then consider how are we going to be able to leverage data and technology that's at our disposal to give that to her. It's a very, very different starting place, and it will be a very different ending place. So this really comes down to some core principles of consumer first marketing. You have to be able to recognize her immediately. You have to leverage all the insight available to understand and predict the context of what she is expecting from you in that moment of interaction. And you have to be relevant with the delivery of that message and the way you reach out to her, and be empathetic and meaningful in the message itself. That's really what today's webinar is about, the steps you need to start following as a marketer to be able to reach and engage with this entitled consumer. And then, Adam, we were talking a bit about what that might mean, and do you want to share some light on kind of where we came to with these steps?
Yeah, absolutely, Kat. Thanks so much, and thanks to all of you for joining today's webcast. Yes, we really tried to think about this need that we all have to connect with our consumers, connect with those consumers who are really transient in the different devices that they're using, and they're distracted and they have a lot coming at them. And we wanted to take a step back and say, hey, if my goal is to become a consumer-first marketer that is designing programs around what my consumer really cares about, how do I get there? Because it's something that we often talk about. There's probably been a few other webcasts you've been on that have talked about this as a goal, but we wanted to break this down into 7 steps that we can start to take today to really take action to get ourselves there. And the first is really around getting our data organized. You know, if we think about this for a moment, you know, data is certainly something that has been important to our industry for quite some time, but we often use data either that's already available, or we're using data maybe in different aspects of the customer experience, and we're not necessarily organizing this around our consumer or thinking about what that consumer experience really is. So our first step as we start to talk about what it means to organize our data is really to think about how we can make sure that our customer is at the center of not only our experience strategy, but our data strategy. You know, as Kat said, you know, millennials are using multiple devices. You know, we now own 4 devices almost on average. I think that's an incredible number of devices. And when we think about what our consumers are doing, and I have 4 devices on my desk right now as I'm having this presentation, you know, if we think about this, I'm using lots of devices, and there's really, as a consumer, no understanding that a brand that I'm interacting with is different on those different devices or in those different channels. The expectation is there that they should be able to pick up at any point, however they want to, on their terms to continue the customer experience. And Gartner estimates that there's now 6.4 billion connected devices that are in use. And if we think about that, it's beyond just our trusty computers and our smartphones, but tablets and IoT wearable devices, you know, in-store beacons. There are a number of ways that consumers are interacting and even purchasing from us. And, you know, even things like Apple TV. where Gilt and QVC and other retailers have really led the way with bringing a whole new way to purchase and a new way to interact with content. That's not the traditional e-commerce that we all grew up with. I think for many of us on the call, and certainly myself, my career started in a web world, and for many years it was really about the web. But there are so many new ways that consumers have started to interact, and they're increasingly coming to the market. If we think about, really for a couple of decades, a web mentality was really dominant as the way that you interacted via the internet. And then with the launch of smartphones and then tablets, this whole cascade of new opportunities has really introduced themselves. And that's really given way to, Kat, what I think is a beautiful way to articulate this, that CPA, or that continuous partial attention that really exists out there. If we think about those devices that I have, I'm shifting between them. OMD out of the UK did a study a little over a year ago that said we're shifting between devices on average 21 times per hour. And that sounds insane for a moment until you look at what you're doing right now, and you're probably going between a couple different devices right now, or certainly in the evening when you're catching up on work and watching TV and checking your smartphone. It actually doesn't seem that unrealistic to think about the number of times that we're switching between devices. And with this breeds a lot of reasons for distractions, and really a lot of reasons why, unfortunately, our consumers won't complete an experience the way we want them to. They will abandon a shopping cart for an old tried and true example. And that's not necessarily always the case. If we're thinking about the customer experience more holistically, and we're designing our data and our understanding about the consumer really around the consumer and not around the device itself, we might find that that consumer isn't abandoning, and that experience certainly is continuing, and it's an ideal experience. It perhaps just shifted devices, and maybe the way in which we look at it needs to evolve to get there. So it's not necessarily that that my experience is changing radically from the core elements of it, but it is that it's perhaps migrating across multiple devices. And when we think about this, as we're talking about the idea of organizing data, one of the things that I do want to emphasize here is that this is not a BI task on its own. This is really the job for us as marketers and customer experience professionals to think about the experience and think about the journey that our customers take across the different touch points and channels, because that's really where our opportunity exists. So when we think about all of these devices, all of the shifting of devices, this means that there's a lot of data being generated. And while a lot of us have gotten better in the last decade or so at looking at how data describes experiences and describes campaigns, we need to think about how we can connect this really valuable resource that we have across those devices and across those journeys. And it really starts with, as I mentioned, getting organized. So that means inside of our organizations, we start with taking an internal survey, an inventory of the data we have. And what I mean by that is really establishing a view of what data are we collecting from different channels, be it email, on-site, display campaigns, etc., and establishing what we like to call a vendor-neutral data layer. And what I mean by that is let's go back to what we all know for a moment and think about the web for a second. If I'm on a traditional web experience for an e-commerce site, let's say, and I look at a product page, on that product page, there's a wealth of information that describes things that are going on that page. And so as a consumer goes to that page, everything from product price, SKU, color, etc., are all data points that you're certainly probably passing through right now to your analytics vendor. But when you take a moment and survey and inventory the data that you have and where it's going, you might recognize opportunities to unlock that data that might just be going to your analytics solution and maybe onto your analyst and BI team, but that might be really helpful for you to better understand that customer experience in that moment and up-level that and make that available to your email marketing team or your on-site personalization team, because there are data points that are accessible there. And when we think about it, and maybe vendor neutral is not just the right way to think about it, but thinking about this data that is described about the customer itself that could flourish when it's made available to other people in your organization and the tools that they use. And this also then gets us to the third point of that organizational step one, is to standardize what we call things. I grew up in the web analytics world and things like SPROPs and EVARs, but when you think about it, I am not an SPROP or an EVAR. For those of you on the phone, hopefully you're getting a chuckle out of that know what I'm talking about. For those of you that don't know what the heck I'm talking about, congratulations, because those aren't real things. And so what we talk about when we're deciding how we want to define something, we should think about it in what this is for my business. So a product name, human readable language that describes what an attribute is, or a segment, or an audience affiliation, or an attribute is that describes this person. And let's standardize that with the way that we talk about that data internally, and make sure that we're making that data available to the vendors itself. And whether a vendor might change that into custom metric 14 or SBROT 5, that's great. But let's start from a common definition inside of our organization that will help us leverage and take advantage of this data more easily. So the next step really is, I think, to honor for a moment, once we've gotten our data organized, is to really think about what that data is. That data is not ones and zeros and pie charts and graphs. While that's certainly the result, and that's the way that a lot of us interact with this data from time to time, what it really is, at the end of the day, is our customers' behavior. It's them actually raising their hands to describe what they care about, what's important, and how we can understand what's going on in the customer experience. So we need to really make sure that we're understanding what's happening in that experience. And I think walking in our customer's shoes is the right way to do it. Look at what that cross-device experience actually looks like for your business. Maybe make sure that you're capturing data as you walk through the experience on your website or on your mobile application or beyond, to make sure you're capturing everything that you need to know to understand what's working, what's not, and make sure that you're capturing those nuggets of information that can help you better get to know your customer. Kat, I'd love to toss this over to you to learn a little bit more about what you think this idea of really empathizing with our customers really looks like.
Yeah, and Adam, what you just said is so important. It is about having the right aspects of data, the right sources of data along those journeys. But in order to do that, you really need to think about what those journeys are. And like we were talking about, the place to start is to think not from your shoes, but from your consumer's shoes. So the way that we really encourage our clients to empathize is to first start literally by anecdotally considering, how do your consumers relate with your brand? When are they engaging, and what are they doing? Think about it from their perspective, not from your organization's perspective. Think about it from all of the key processes and identify them. What are those moments? What are those processes? And you really should have fun with this. Get in a room, brainstorm, get some Post-it notes out, and contemplate and define the major paths. When, why, how, what do they want from me in that moment? And then once you have done that filter, apply a more quantitative consideration. Look for validation of what you believe those things are. Now, this can come from a number of places. It might be that you have actual response from your campaigns, which of course is a critical place to start. But you could also have net promoter scores. Maybe you have access to focus groups. Maybe you also have the opportunity, and if you don't, you should look for ways to get that opportunity to directly solicit consumer feedback. Certainly this can be surveys, voice of the customer follow-up, requests for reviews, and responses to customer service interactions. But it could also be from social media. And go out and see what you can gather to validate what you believe are your consumer needs from your brand and their expectations of how those interactions are happening today. And one of the most important things that is a huge resource or a huge research opportunity is your customer care, your front line. They know and understand what your consumers are asking of them and sharing with them. And so tapping into that is a very critical aspect for you to validate what are those journeys that my customers and my consumers really need and want from me. And then when you think about that, with each of those major journeys that you've now, you need to look closely at what it is that you now understand your consumer wants and needs from that moment versus what are you actually giving them? What are you delivering? And does that or does that not meet the expectation that they have from you in that moment?
I think that's so important, Kat. And first of all, shout out to that image on the right, because that is the story of my life from both sides of it. But, I think when we think about the actual versus the ideal, this underscores this need to really think about what we're looking at here when it comes to data, and understanding that, this data is really the language of how we understand what our customers really care about. And the better we get at this, the more loyalty we will actually foster in our own relationships with our customers. There was some great data that's come out from a number of sources, but really I think MasterCard captured it really nicely in their OmniShopper report that said, the majority of us, 70%, prefer to buy from merchants that we know. And actually they found for the first time that looking at all of the transactional data that they have, which they have a lot of it, they're finding that consumers are starting to spend at fewer merchants than they were before. So this is really showing that consumers are looking to vote, and they're voting not just on all the things that we know, free shipping or low prices. They're really looking to maintain relationships with merchants that they know and trust. And so therefore, our end of the bargain really has to be held up to make sure that we're building the relationships and understanding them and using data in the right way to be able to make sure that we capture that share of their attention span and their share of wallet. Kat, we might have lost you there.
Oh my goodness, so sorry.
Welcome back.
I was just saying that we have to ask ourselves. He knows me well. But I was just saying that we have to ask ourselves really hard questions in order to be able to deliver on all of these opportunities for our consumer. And so what that means is now we've figured out kind of all the journeys that we have to have, and we've identified all the ways ideally that we want to be able to deliver on our consumer expectations. But then there's a layer to this of, can I do it? And we all can't do all of it today. We have limitations. We have to be able to prioritize in order to progress. So take a hard look at your programs with this new understanding of what you're hoping to deliver, and consider the possibilities given your organization, your resources, your infrastructure. It's kind of like Adam was saying earlier. You have to have a very realistic view of kind of like all of your data, what you're organizing, and what you want to accomplish to be able to filter based on that. And then what we suggest you do is plot your options. Really consider the programs that you've identified and you've defined, and do some benefit versus level of effort comparison to help you identify the areas where you can have the most impact. Focus on the plans to execute for those programs first.
Kat, I love that. I love that approach. I love the idea of taking the exercise with Post-it notes or just on a big sheet of paper and really prioritize based on level of effort, the ROI that you can get. And I'll have an example that I'll talk about in a moment on that. But then I think this brings us to the fifth step, which is let's flex our muscles here. And I think more importantly, honor the fact that while technology and amazing vendors and new channels and new devices have exploded over the last number of years, the technology alone can't solve this problem. I love this. You guys have probably seen a lot of this over the years from chiefmartech.com, which charts out just the number of vendors and categories that exist that are helping to build and solve the customer experience need for us. But in 2011, that was about 150 technologies that were out there, and now they're tracking about 4,000 different technologies, and we're using lots of them as marketers and customer experience professionals. And they're doing great things, but it's incumbent upon us as marketers to think about what this experience really is and build the right processes in place to bring these things to life. Nobody can save us except ourselves. Technology can't solve those fundamental problems. And when we think about what those are, we need to think that technology is the enabler that's allowing us to take advantage of all these new channels. But at the end of the day, we as marketers still know our business well, and we know the fundamentals of our consumers. So we need to still honor that. And just because the device and the screen has changed and maybe things have moved from the physical to the digital realm, the core elements, the core attributes of our brand or our business largely remain the same. But we need to make sure that we're putting together the right approach inside of our organization. I think last year, in the last couple of years, people have talked about breaking down the silos. that's not really a thing. We can't go in and just smash all the silos inside of our organizations, because those silos and those teams that are working with tools and data sets about our consumers, they're doing so for a reason, and largely they're doing the right thing. But it's our job, if we want to build this more holistic consumer-first experience, we need to talk about connecting them. So smashing them and breaking them down, probably not something that's going to happen, but we can do our job at connecting them. And I think that's a much easier way to approach this conversation, because we don't have to think about boiling the ocean. So here what we need to do to flex our muscles in this part of it, we talked about the first one in the first step, which is, let's identify that data, but not just the data that sits out there that describes our experience, but let's also identify those stakeholders, the teams, the tools, those silos even, that are using this data and have a stake in this data, and let's get them connected. And let's get them connected based on our shared goals inside of our company around the user experience or the customer experience and the data that results from that and that can feed that. And understand that those are generally two of the biggest drivers that our teams care about. What's the experience that I'm providing in my channel? And hey, if I can actually work with those around me to get more data to help describe what's happening in other channels or other parts of the business, that can make my part of the experience better. So it's important for us to internally in our own organizations meet with those team members early, meet with them often, so that way we can make sure that we're establishing or following the right processes that have been built in our organizations, so that we can also foster more of this consumer-first, data-driven culture inside. And while there are lots of different processes and formulas that we can take into this, I think honoring the fact that at the end of the day, we need to connect between our stakeholders, and we need to do so on a regular basis, share the wins, share the failures. Hopefully failures are fast and limited, but we're learning from them, so that way we can build more of a culture that drives experimentation.
Yeah, and I think connection is a very important word here. Not only the connection like you described just now, Adam, internally with all of your stakeholders, but also the connection between your consumer and the message that you're trying to get across to them. Because you as a brand have information that you want to share, but it won't be heard unless you apply it with the right tone and topic for your consumer to appreciate it. Only 7% of customers say that the offers they receive from companies are consistently relevant. And, this stat here is so disturbing that 27% are actually turned off with the wrong messaging. So rather than lose them, you need to think about them in your messaging. And you really need to think about it from a data side. There's no way to assemble dynamically in the moment all these millions of right messages that you need to reach every single consumer. The only way to do it is if you're working with templates and content snippets and automation and data that allows you to marry the message to the mindset of your consumer in that moment. Messaging today requires a much more data-centric approach that is dynamically positioned to respond whenever your consumer chooses to engage. And I think that the other key piece here is that you never get to the end. You never get to the finish line. Once you have data-driven messaging and automation in place, you have to continue to optimize. You have to build that into your regular work culture, that you have to ongoing analyze results, confirm that you're continuing to meet your consumers' expectations over time. And to do this, testing is a critical part of that process. Subject lines, creative, time of delivery, context, offers, everything needs to be tested and retested on an ongoing basis, because change is inevitable. Your consumer changes, your organization changes, technology changes. So this has to be an endless loop of analysis and improvement, because you just aren't ever going to be able to consider this the finish line, because it keeps moving, that finish line. Adam, I'm sure you have thoughts on this as well. Such a huge topic.
Yeah, absolutely, Kat. And I think, this idea, if we think about how much is changing from the way that consumers are shifting to new devices and screen sizes, et cetera, there are learnings that exist out there. And so if we're not constantly developing a culture that rewards experimentation and optimization, we might have some blind spots that get developed around the best way to position our value props or design for our products, or the way we allow people to buy based on where they are in that moment, and what devices they're using and what they care about. So we need to constantly be learning because we're at the forefront of this. And I think that's an exciting thing when we think about the long history of working with consumers. This is changing, and no one before us has ever done this. So we get the opportunity to learn as we do, which I think is something really powerful. Kat, I think this is a great segue into talking about a few of the companies that we're working with and how they're taking advantage of some of these steps. And I think we have three here that we'll talk through. I'm going to tackle the first one here with a company that maybe some of you have heard of before, but a company that I think is really unique in the way that they're approaching their business model in general. And this is a company called Dover Saddlery. This is a company that I think has continually innovated its business model to compete in new ways in both the digital and the physical realm by leveraging what they know about their consumers to make sure that they're tailoring the best possible experience. They're kind of an interesting one too, where they were more of a catalog and online shop before they started building stores. And so they're kind of going the opposite way that a lot of folks have, which is usually physical stores the other way around. And what their goals were really at the outset when they started working with us was to say, look, we have this long history that starts with our catalog data and even starts with just other offline data that we have that doesn't talk to the online experience. And as we're seeing this evolution where more people are migrating between channels online and migrating between the offline as we build more stores and the online, we need to be able to get those things together across our brands, across our devices and channels to better understand what we can do to build the best brand and the best experience as possible that's using data that we care about from our customer standpoint. And that means all of the offline attributes and the online ones. And so this is a great example of what I talked about earlier. These are data points. This is part of that inventory process to say, hey, what's all the data that I have at my fingertips? And think for a moment about how you could use this when you walk into another team's meeting that you don't typically work with and say, hey, here are all the other things that we use in our side of the business to measure what's working, and here are all the things that we have access to. Imagine what could light up with new teams and new tools being able to have access to that data. And that's really what Dover Saddlery really did, was leveraging Tealium to bring together all of the data across the channel. So it now no longer matters what exists in one silo or another. All of this is together and can be then activated on by really whomever in the organization. And that then creates a huge opportunity and then one of those boil the ocean, OMG, what am I going to start with first? And this then gets us to that point that Kat brought up earlier, which is let's prioritize this. Let's start smart. And so looking at level of effort and ROI, one of the first things that they did was to say, hey, let's take some of our best real estate that we have out there on our homepage, and let's make sure that we're using what we know about the consumer across channels to make sure that their riding preference, this is a company that focuses on equestrian products and lifestyle products of people that have different disciplines and different sporting aspects that they approach things in, what brands, what categories, what they really care about from an attribute standpoint. And let's use that data that we have across online and offline from how people have interacted with us, and let's go ahead and make sure that we're building the right experience for them. This is certainly an endeavor and work that they had to do this, but we're not talking about revolutionizing everything at square one. We're talking about, hey, let's start with our biggest bang, our biggest real estate that we have digitally, and that's the first page of our brand site. And by doing that and by replacing what was static or driven more seasonally with what's driven by the consumer, they drove an additional 5.2% revenue per visitor, and they improved their conversion rates by 4.8%. And so that's the type of opportunity that you have to just chip away at this opportunity that exists by leveraging data, listening to what our customers care about, and then acting on that over time, step by step, and building the right customer and consumer first experience. Kat, I'll turn it over to you to talk about a couple other examples.
So one of the great examples that I think of kind of bringing all of this together is extra space storage. Now, they're a company who really kind of has a product that at first glance you would think is very kind of hard to relate to because it's storage space. And they had a challenge in that 45% of people booked reservations but didn't actually turn up on move-in day. So they really needed to increase conversion rates. And they started thinking about their consumer and all the reasons why they might need storage. Then they went and they validated their thoughts with analytics and with every information they could gather, including direct surveys. And what they discovered is that it's actually a very emotional moment. Maybe I'm moving, maybe I'm selling a house, maybe I'm downsizing, and I have a lot of fears and concerns over this process. And so when they really looked at that, they started brainstorming. And they said, what are the actual things that each person is going through in those key moments along the journey of these very emotional experiences? They wanted to imagine what those consumers could hear from Extra Space that might assuage their concerns and help them make the final decision to actually go ahead and move into that space. So they did research to determine what the main questions consumers had at the point of rental, and based on those questions, they thought through all of this. And the result was that they actually produced an awful lot of content and information tailored specifically to what those consumers all along that journey might need. They got videos together to answer key questions and to give tours and to make sure everybody understood the complete experience before they even came into the space. They produced dynamic emails personalized for each customer that automatically triggered at different points along the way to help them over their questions and concerns and nurture them from the day they opened the dialogue to the day they actually moved in. And they gave the consumers the impression that they were valuable, helpful partners at this challenging time in their lives. And one of the things that I think is most interesting is they focused on providing context by bringing live content into these communications. So for example, they actually incorporated real-time weather feeds. Imagine if during your move-in day it's actually going to be raining. Well, isn't that wonderful information to know the tips on how you can ensure waterproofing? And by the way, we sell waterproofing, and here's the products that you might want for that. They also were able to incorporate geographic information, so to help you plot your course from your house to your new storage space and make that very seamless and easy. So all of this together resulted in a really impressive lift of nearly 12% of conversion simply by focusing this consumer-first approach and bringing it all together. What do they need? What can I do? How can I deliver that to them? Another great example is StumbleUpon. Now, StumbleUpon is a discovery content platform. They have indexed over 150 billion web pages, all to serve up the content that's right for you. 70% of their audience happens to be millennials, and they consume an average of 3.5 hours of content each month. But this is an example of their mobile app, and basically you give your preferences to them on what you're interested in. You go ahead and stumble, you get some content, you rate it, and then it continues to improve the recommendations they're therefore able to give you over time. But they had a problem because there was a decline in new users, and they really wanted to invert that trend. So their marketing team launched into a major initiative to analyze and optimize their program through comprehensive testing, and the results were surprising. First, they discovered that they were using email all wrong. They believed that email was a promotional tool for StumbleUpon or a re-engagement tool. But actually, they found out that what their consumers wanted was more of a landing page with the 5 most relevant content topics for that day delivered to their inbox. They also found that while session length seemed to be declining, in reality, it was just that consumer behavior had changed. Millennials weren't spending as much time in a single visit, but they were engaging more frequently in shorter visits throughout the day, which actually added up to more total time stumbling overall. And the last thing was that the topic mix wasn't matching their consumer. Millennials weren't just college kids anymore. They were the parents, the debts, decisions, challenges of life. So they wanted more serious information, and they wanted it from authentic sources. So what did StumbleUpon do about all this? A few things. Their marketing team launched a major initiative around creating a new email product. So they actually created personalized bi-weekly emails with 5 topics. that came each day, and they saw amazing lift, 60% open rate, 10% click-throughs. They focused on much smaller snackable content segments that were tailored to those quick moments when people engaged. They actually used lower quality video, which could play very quickly. And they used content that was exclusively designed for the 6-inch screen first, since most of their audience was engaging through mobile. And they also tapped into influential thought leaders so that they could bring in new content from new folks and new content sources with more interesting content for their audience. So today, they are adding 250,000 new users every month. All of the rates are trending up, and they built testing into their regular processes so that they can continue this positive trend and optimize into the future. And I think those are two really great examples of what we're talking about. Actually a few. And I think that was pretty much what we had to talk about today. Adam, I don't know if you have anything else that you want to add?
No, I think that's great. I think we might have a few minutes for some questions as well.
Yes, thanks, Kat and Adam. We are definitely going to open up the floor for questions. So find that Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and start submitting your questions. We've had a couple that have already come in, so I'll just start with those. And Kat and Adam, I'll let you tackle those based on who you think is the best person. So the first question is, how important is this shift to consumer-first marketing if your customer base skews older than millennials?
I'll start that and then throw it over to you, Kat. I would say that we all act like millennials in a lot of ways. So while there may be certain attributes that exist out there that we've associated with millennials, I think if you rewind some of the news articles back several years, one of the questions that was going to exist would be, how are millennial behaviors going to evolve as they get older? Are they going to follow more traditional paths? And the fact is, no, actually not at all. Those of us around them and older than them certainly started to adapt some of the same ideas, which is we have lots of technology at our fingertips, lots of devices at our fingertips, and the bar has been raised by some of the other industries and companies out there that are building really beautiful experiences for their consumers. And so our expectations are a lot higher. Kat, since you talk a lot about millennials, I'd love your thought on this.
I totally agree, but I also think that millennial behavior has infected our society. I mean, my grandmother has an iPhone and she texts me all the time. And I think that what we really need to do is we need to take the lessons of our kinetic society, of our mobile society, and apply it across the board to your consumer bases. So what that means is the way that we talk today about thinking about who is interacting with your brand and how are they interacting, that really applies to all of the cohorts in our society. It's just that when we talk about the shift in consumer behavior, it really is because in some way, no matter what generation you're from, you have been changed because of technology. And so it's another factor that we need to bring into thinking about consumer first and what it means for any age or any group to be relating to us. And so I think it is critical to look beyond the millennial and bring that back into your marketing.
Plus, we can tell everyone that we are getting younger because we're all acting like millennials. So I think that's a benefit there as well.
Very good. Next question has come in. If you're just getting started with a consumer-first approach, is there one program that you would recommend to test the waters?
Well, I'll start with that one. I definitely have a thought that I think that, while some people just either definitely already automated maybe your onboarding stream or your welcome stream, I do think that focusing very much on initial engagement is still a critical piece, especially focusing on initial experience after first conversion. It is such an important time to make sure that you capture the loyalty of your consumer. And the other place that I would say is incredibly important is just to look at your customer care. If somebody reaches out to you and asks for support, are you there for them? Are you able to provide that support? And so I would think those are two very important places to start when you're looking at at your expectation analysis with your consumers. Adam, do you have different thoughts or other thoughts?
No, I agree with that fully. I think we sometimes underestimate the value of somebody who is sharing in, writing in, tweeting in feedback. For everyone that's actually going through that effort to do so, there are tons more people that aren't. So making sure that we're listening to those, adapting to those, and really honoring how we make the first-time user experience or the end-to-end user experience as strong as possible. I do think, there are examples that we've seen with customers, and I think Dover's a great example of looking at, the homepage or just what those very tangible experiences are, just one at a time, to try to, again, not try to boil the ocean, but focus on those individual areas. So that way I can make sure that I'm taking advantage of what I know or taking some context into why the person's there. And I'm showing that I'm acting on that, at least in that first impression or that most valuable first impression.
That's great. Thank you, guys. Next question that we have. We collect a lot of data about our customers, and there's no way we can use it all. What types of data give you the biggest bang for your buck when it comes to personalization and driving conversions?
That's a great question also.
I can start with that one. Okay. I think there's an argument to be had around, do I collect absolutely everything or do I just collect what's most important? I won't argue both sides of that today. I do think that once you have the data you need, getting the biggest impact out of doing things, there are, for us that are building these experiences, there are only so many hours in the day. And while we can certainly whiteboard out tons of ideas, I think we need to think about what we possibly can design for right now. And that's quite literally what our designers and developers and copywriters and marketers can actually build. And there might not be time to build 100 different iterations of something based on 100 different permutations of something. So, up-leveling to what are a couple higher level things that I want to test and learn more about. And, there's an example that I go to from a travel company that looked at, we have people that are abandoning our booking engine, and sure, we can go ahead and do retargeting that says, hey, I see that you abandoned your trip to San Diego, but that's not really getting over a certain threshold. They're not really getting the impact that they expected, and so they looked at the experience in that process of abandonment, and they looked at a data point around how many people were using our search functionality to sort from lowest to highest price, and maybe there's a higher level, something that I can address there from people that are clearly searching for the lowest fare or the lowest cost. And let's go ahead and engage them on some of our brand attributes and product attributes around, how can we save you money or make sure that we're getting the most out of your investment. So that's not them designing a lot of different creative, but it's about them saying, look, I have a hunch about something that's happening with my consumers, and I want to build one experience or one email program or one retargeting program that's to that audience to test and kind of peel back the onion a bit for them. And again, that's not sitting down and building a huge long project with hundreds of different permutations. It's really around, starting small, figuring out where on that prioritization matrix that Kat walked them through, where should I start and what can I test and what can I learn today?
Right. I think that makes a heck of a lot of sense. And I also totally agree. And when you said there's so much data out there and you can't you can't look at everything, the thing that I find is that sometimes people get overwhelmed, and so therefore they don't make progress in sifting through their data and using it. And I think that the piece that we need to make sure we don't lose sight of is there's always a place to start and there's always a place to move forward with data to improve your program. One of the things that I think is incredibly important is to look for ways that you can start to bring behavioral data into your program. And that for a lot of companies might seem like a very large and daunting task, but there is always a way to start, even if it is not completely, automating every experience across the website and across every communication. but in some way to be able to look at what are the possible options for me to take behavioral data and start to use it to respond more personally to folks. And sometimes that can be being able to, leverage in real time and gather behavior from the online experience. Sometimes it might even be just going back historically, grabbing, recent activity and leveraging it to categorize probable likes and dislikes for folks and bringing that into how you tweak your messaging. But I think behavioral is something that we should all be looking at and saying, what does it tell me about somebody and how can I start to use it? If I already am, how can I advance that forward? And if I am not, where can I begin to start really looking at that type of data? Because it really helps you get close to your consumer's mindset.
Excellent. Well, Kat, Adam, thank you very much. That is all the time we have for today's presentation. Any questions that we weren't able to get to during the session will be answered individually after the event. And an archived recording of the event will be available on our website and will be emailed out to all of you once it's live. Thank you all for attending.